Good afternoon, everyone. The Subcommittee on Cyber, Innovative Technologies, and Information Systems will come to order. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. I'm looking forward to their testimony. I'm going to give an opening statement in just a minute and then yield to the ranking member for her opening statement. But before we do, I just have to do some read some uh, technical information for our members, including myself, who are joining by remotely by video. So with that, I'd like to welcome the members who are joining today's remote hearing. Members who are joining must be visible on screen for the purposes of identity verification, establishing and maintaining a quorum, participating in the proceeding, and voting. Those members must continue to use the software platform's video function while in attendance unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render them unable to participate on camera. If a member experiences technical difficulties, they should contact the committee staff for assistance. Video of members' participation will be broadcast via the television internet feeds. Members participating remotely must seek recognition verbally, and they are asked to mute their microphones when they are not speaking. Members who are participating remotely are reminded to keep the software platform's video function on the entire time they attend the proceeding. Members may leave and rejoin the proceeding. If members depart for a short while for reasons other than joining a different proceeding, they should leave the video function on. If members will be absent for a significant period or depart to join a different proceeding, they should exit the software platform entirely and then rejoin if they return. Members may use the software platform's chat feature to communicate with staff regarding technical or logistical support issues only. Finally, I have designated a committee staff member to, if necessary, mute unrecognized members' microphones to cancel any inadvertent background noise that may disrupt the proceeding. So with that, I'm going to begin my opening statement. As I said, then yield to the ranking member. But I want to welcome everyone to our hearing today on the Department of Defense's electromagnetic spectrum operations. I want to thank Ranking Member Stefanik for joining me and holding this hearing today. And I would like to recognize also my good friend and colleague on the city subcommittee, colleague Representative Morrison, for his leadership on this issue as co-chair of the Electromagnetic Warfare Working Group, along with his fellow co-chairs, Representative Austin Scott and Dodd Bacon, and proud to be a co-chair with them as well. I also want to thank our witnesses, of course, for appearing today. Today, we welcome Mr. Brian Clark, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology at the Hudson Institute. Also, Dr. William Bill Conley, a former Director for Electronic Warfare in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and Dr. Joseph Joe Kirschbaum, Director of the Government Accountability Office, Defense Capabilities and Management Team. Thank you all for appearing today. The electromagnetic spectrum underpins nearly every aspect of the modern U.S. military, and as co-chair of the Electromagnetic Warfare Working Group, I have long recognized its importance. The department uses the electromagnetic spectrum for situational awareness, communicating with friendly forces, identifying enemy capabilities, directing strikes, navigation, and countless other tasks. In fact, nearly every U.S. military capability, from airplanes to night vision goggles, satellites, ships, and radios, depend on the spectrum to function, and they depend on it today. This isn't just something in the future. This is something to depend on today. While previous city hearings covered what lies ahead in defense, again, the military is facing unseen challenges in the electromagnetic spectrum right now. Many of the United States' most important weapon systems, like the F-35 or Ford-class aircraft carrier, are at a disadvantage today without uncompromised access to the electromagnetic spectrum. So this challenge and the importance of electromagnetic spectrum operations will only grow as emerging technologies like autonomous weapons, connected battle networks, artificial intelligence, and directed energy continue to fundamentally change warfare. Future combat will be less about the capability of individual weapon systems and more about how a networked system of systems communicate and work together through the use of the electromagnetic spectrum. Seeing this trend, competitive nations like China and Russia are developing their own capabilities to dominate this domain and connect their forces. These governments believe the electromagnetic spectrum represents a potential critical vulnerability for the U.S. military, which they can exploit to reduce our advantage and the efficacy of our high-end weapon systems. Recent cases in the field speak to this. Russia has conducted electronic attacks against U.S. coalition forces in Syria, and in 2018, then U.S. Special Operations Command head General Raymond Thomas called it, and I quote, "the most aggressive electronic warfare environment on the planet from our adversaries," end quote. So we saw a similar activity in Ukraine when Russians launched surprised artillery strikes using signals emanating from Ukrainian troops' cell phones. There are also alarming reports of directed energy incidents targeting U.S. government personnel, producing extremely concerning bioeffects, the phenomenon known as Havana syndrome. So Congress and the department have therefore undertaken significant efforts recently to position and equip the U.S. military for success. I want to recognize the progress the department and the military services have made furthering these efforts. However, we have more work to do to ensure that the United States maintains its military, it maintains its advantage and closes the gap where we have lost our edge. As the department modernizes its systems and capabilities, it must ensure that both new and existing platforms are networked together in a joint environment. To do so, we need to develop the right management structure, strategy, and resources at the Department of Defense. And I know our witnesses will have much insight into how to accomplish these objectives. So with that, I look forward to hearing from our expert panel. But first, I'll turn to the ranking member Ranking Member Stefanik for her remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Langevin, and thank you to our witnesses today. The electromagnetic spectrum is the, quote, the invisible battlefield, end quote, and a domain in which the U.S. military's success depends. However, our dominance in this domain is no longer secure. The Department of Defense's electromagnetic spectrum superiority strategy lays out a path to reassert our overmatch within the electromagnetic operating environment while also recognizing the important evolution of private sector spectrum use. As the department's strategy points out, this new dynamic in the spectrum environment will present opportunities as well as challenges. However, the strategy is clear in its goal: freedom of action in the electromagnetic spectrum at the time, place, and parameters of our choosing. This is a requirement for the continuation, this is a requirement for the continuation of our operations in any domain. Hold on one second. It is difficult to understate the importance and range of spectrum operations undertaken by the department, from critical command, control, and communications to electronic warfare and weapons guidance. The ability to operate in spectrum is an existential capability for our armed forces. Yet spectrum is a finite resource that has become a congested, constrained, and contested environment. Actions by other countries and their militaries, the private sector and their operations, and various regulations all restrict our military's ability to operate within spectrum. It is within this framework that Congress and the department must take concentrated steps to stay ahead of our adversaries and innovate new technologies to achieve the goals of the strategy. One of the most concerning threats is our adversaries' decades of studying our reliance on spectrum to conduct every aspect of military operations. China and Russia specifically are testing and developing offensive and defensive capabilities to be used against our systems. All the while, we have failed to transform our own capabilities to stay ahead of these near-peer competitors. Russia's employment of spectrum operations in 2014 to disrupt their adversaries' capabilities in Ukraine and rapidly capture Ukrainian territory should serve as a stark warning of our adversaries' evolving spectrum capabilities. However, I am encouraged by the department recognizing this problem, and Congress must be willing to support efforts to boost our competitive advantage as quickly as possible. We must also find solutions to balance DOD's need to access certain bands of spectrum with the private sector and rural communities' critical need to develop spectrum for modern communications and 5G capabilities. Our nation's private sector and civilian access to spectrum correlates directly with our economic competitiveness and, by extension, our national security as well. Our adversaries, especially China, recognize the inextricable link between spectrum development and national power. Going forward, we will have to determine how to most efficiently and effectively allocate spectrum to ensure both economic prosperity and military superiority. The benefits of correctly balancing these priorities are profound, while the consequences of getting this balance wrong could be disastrous. With that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back. Chairman, I think you're muted.
I am. Thank you very much, Elise. And I want to thank the ranking member for her remarks. And we'll now receive testimony from Mr. Brian Clark. Mr. Clark is a senior fellow and director for the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology at the Hudson Institute. He was also the primary author of a review mandated by the 2019 NDAA entitled Winning the Invisible War, which I'm sure we'll hear about today. Mr. Clark, you are now recognized to summarize your testimony for 5 minutes, and we welcome you before the subcommittee today.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Chairman Langevin, Ranking Member Stefanik, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to talk about the challenges and opportunities facing U.S. military operations in the electromagnetic spectrum. As you've noted, the spectrum is arguably the most important environment to model warfare. It connects nearly every one of our forces together across multiple domains. It's also the mechanism by which almost all of our sensing, navigation, and communication technologies work. It's also, in a lot of ways, the most unheralded warfighting space, at least within the U.S. defense community. Although we experience the spectrum every day through our smartphones and our mobile computers and the vehicle collision avoidance systems in our cars, in a lot of ways, it's a forgotten domain because we can't feel it like the land or really experience it every time we get on the computer like cyberspace. So despite its invisibility, though, access to the electromagnetic spectrum is critical for U.S. forces, who without it wouldn't be able to do the combined arms warfare that they've perfected in a lot of ways over the last century of integrating forces from multiple domains. America's adversaries, particularly Russia and China, recognize this importance of the spectrum, and as you noted, they've been aggressively pursuing mechanisms to deny the spectrum to U.S. forces so they can take apart the ability of the battle networks U.S. Military uses to conduct operations and successful operations like we've done in Iraq and Afghanistan, or even in Kosovo. Unfortunately, during the 2 decades that followed the Cold War, the U.S. largely sat on its hands and let its rivals get a leg up on them in the electromagnetic spectrum. We didn't do a lot of advancements in technologies or operational concepts, and we let them get ahead of us in many ways. So multiple assessments have now argued that the U.S. military, in a lot of ways, is behind its rivals in the electromagnetic spectrum and electromagnetic spectrum technologies, particularly China. And at this point, given the time frame we're looking at, Admiral Davidson just recently talked about there being less than a decade for us to deter China and our fiscal constraints, we're not going to be able to go and system versus system try to match the Russian and Chinese and rest of world's electromagnetic spectrum capabilities. We're going to have to instead mount some different kind of effort to use different operational concepts and different technologies to get a spectrum advantage. Keeping us back from that, unfortunately, is that today about 40% of the Pentagon's electromagnetic warfare related procurement and research development funding goes to about 10 platform-centric programs that largely perpetuate the Cold War operational approaches that we relied on from 30 years ago, such as using manned jamming aircraft to communicate or to confuse sensors that enemies use for air defenses so we can get a manned bomber in to go attack a target. We still use those tactics, even though 30 years ago that was the state of the art. Now it may not be. So we're going to need to have leap ahead concepts and technologies that move away from these old concepts and try to mount new approaches that allow us to get an advantage in the spectrum. So Congress can help in this effort. According to GAO, a series of recent governance changes that were directed by Congress haven't really yielded the benefits in electromagnetic spectrum superiority that we desired. And so instead of maybe further governance and process changes, Congress should focus now on making sure that DOD pursues the operational concept technology changes that are going to help it gain an advantage in the spectrum competition with adversaries like Russia and China. The new electromagnetic spectrum superiority strategy is a very good part of that. It highlights technologies such as adaptable systems, agile networked electromagnetic warfare, and then virtualized training and testing, as well as open architecture systems. All of those are going to be very important to the new operational concepts and technologies that we need to gain an advantage. Section 152 of last year's NDAA also highlighted some of these technologies. Making those technologies come into fruition, though, is going to require detailed work on the part of the Department of Defense, such as is reflected in the implementation plan for the new electromagnetic spectrum superiority strategy. That implementation plan, though, is going through the Pentagon staffing process and may or eventually come out of it and be acted upon. But it needs to be managed by an organization that's able to really make direction and decisions regarding resourcing and operational concept development, such as the JROC. As opposed to being staffed out and turned into another Pentagon staffing exercise that doesn't result in real change. Before I close, I just want to highlight a couple of technology areas that we're going to need to focus on. Adaptability is going to be very important, and we can talk about that during the hearing. And then also technologies that allow us to be able to maneuver in the spectrum in real time and using AI and cognitive systems to manage that maneuver are going to be very important, which involves electromagnetic battle management and involves the use of new decision support systems for operators. So we're going to have to make a shift in how we manage our operations within the spectrum and move away from traditional methods of controlling the spectrum towards new approaches. If we don't do that, we're going to have our capabilities erode, and we're going to face a situation where our adversaries are going to be able to control the destiny of their warfighting operations, and we won't be able to protect our allies or our own interests. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Clark. I appreciate your testimony and for being here today. We'll now hear from Dr. Bill Connolly. Dr. Connolly is appearing in his personal capacity today, though he was previously the Director of Electronic Warfare in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He is now a Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Mercury Systems. Dr. Connolly, thank you for being here. I appreciate your work in this area for many years. And again, thank you for being here. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony.
Chairman Langevin, Ranking Member Stefanik, distinguished members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to appear today in a personal capacity. This is my first appearance as an individual expert, having departed the Pentagon in 2019. I request that my written statement be included in the record. 2 years ago, I performed an analysis between the Chinese state and the United States, particularly comparing the gross domestic products of the economy, of defense spending, and of research and development using a purchase power ratio comparison. What I found in that is that the Chinese state economy, their gross domestic product, is already 10% larger than ours. Fortunately, their R&D spending is only 80% that of the United States, and their military spending is only 60%. Unfortunately, as the size of their economy continues to grow, we should expect their R&D as well as their defense budgets will continue to increase. This is a very different strategic situation than we faced during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's economy never approached parity with that we had in the United States. I believe the strategic question we're faced with today is this: how do we want to compete? The United States has largely leveraged our manufacturing capacity as a proxy for military strength. Globally, however, we have transitioned into the information age, in which global leadership is defined by innovation, technology development, and technology adoption, as well as integration. Our strategy must reflect this transformation. Back in 2015, China formed their Strategic Support Force, an equal mix of electronic warfare, cyberspace operations, and space operations. The Chinese Strategic Support Force reports directly to their Central Military Commission as a peer of their Army, Navy, Air Force, as well as their Strategic Rocket Force headquarters. In comparison, the United States has maintained electromagnetic warfare as well as spectrum management as capabilities to achieve a tactical outcome. Strategy. I'd like to spend a couple minutes talking about strategy. Electromagnetic battle management, the dynamic reconfiguration of our sensors, of our networks, as well as our electromagnetic attacks in real time, may become the preferred way to achieve power projection when compared to the defensive utilization of the electromagnetic spectrum. As a nation, the United States strategy should be based in innovation, and our technology development in our adoption of these innovations for national defense and in the full integration of these innovations into military tactics and operations. Just inventing it is not adequate today. This is a dramatic departure from our platform and program-centric legacy investment strategy that we have pursued. Instead of viewing capability gaps and shortfalls, EMSO can actually create opportunities for us. Innovation. Where does it come from? What does it mean, and how do we access it? The National Science Foundation reports that across the United States government in totality, accounts for approximately a quarter of our economic investment into research and development. The other 3/4 comes from the private sector. The government should seek to maximize the value of this investment from the commercial sector. For discussion today, I offer 6 major recommendations. The first of which is to incentivize R&D investment by commercial companies, particularly for defense applications. Second, to develop a strategic framework for innovation by both traditional defense contractors as well as non-traditional defense or non-traditional commercial companies. One size does not fit all in this regard. Third, to develop policies to share data broadly across our national innovation base. Government-furnished information really needs to be available to the entirety of the supply chain to generate the maximum return. Fourth, any insight, report, or deliverable generated on a government contract or by a government thought leader should be broadly available to those with a need to know to improve our national competitiveness. Fifth, ensuring a realistic EMSO environment and threat capability that's in budgeting, in testing, as well as in training. Sixth, to establish a strategic offensive EMSO service corps function to create an enduring advantage in this space. In closing, while organization and authority are important, the greatest risk I see today is continuing to apply a legacy strategy to the strategic realities of today. I again thank you for the opportunity to testify and look forward to your questions.
Very good, Dr. Conley. Thank you very much. It will now receive testimony from Dr. Joe Kirschbaum. Dr. Kirschbaum is the director of the Government Accountability Office Defense Capabilities and Management Team. He was the primary author of a review mandated by the 2020 NDAA titled Electromagnetic Spectrum Operations. DOD needs to address governance and oversight issues to help ensure superiority. Dr. Kirschbaum, thank you for being here. You are now recognized to summarize your testimony for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Langevin, Ranking Member Stefanik, and members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the vital role the electromagnetic or EM spectrum plays in the Department of Defense's military operations. My testimony today is based on that report that we issued in December 2020 on DOD electromagnetic spectrum operations. It provides information on the EM spectrum's importance to military operations, adversaries' advantages and advances in spectrum capabilities, and the extent to which the DoD is positioned to ensure spectrum superiority. Now, as my colleagues have pointed out, the EM spectrum is the range of all electromagnetic radiation frequencies, and many technologies, in fact, most that are used on the battlefield, use these frequency bands to operate. DoD is dependent on the EM spectrum across all warfighting domains: air, land, sea, space, and cyberspace. Where warfare from ancient times through much of the industrial age involves strictly line of sight operations and weapons, warfare in the information age involves the use and the denial of use of the EM spectrum at all levels of operation. This includes communications, signals intelligence, information systems, command and control, identifying friendly and adversarial forces, targeting support, and implementing self-protection countermeasures. It's not an exaggeration to say that the ability of our forces to successfully operate anywhere depends on success in the EM spectrum. It's also important to appreciate that the EM spectrum operations take place in the broader context of the information environment. In this context, cyberspace, EMS operations, information operations, and similar activities are all interconnected. This is true in actual war, and it's also true in activities that fall short of the threshold of armed conflict, which is where our primary adversaries seek to operate today. While the United States focused on counterterrorism operations over the last 20+ years, China and Russia were working to advance their peer-to-peer military capabilities, and that includes the EM spectrum operations. Among the advances we've seen in either Russian or Chinese capabilities are the deployment of old and new systems, jammers, small UAVs, et cetera, at the company level. Incorporation of other information-related capabilities, such as cyber, psychological warfare, and demonstration that EMS operations have been integrated into a combined arms doctrine and practice. As part of our work, in addition to interviewing a wide range of defense officials and reviewing original source documents, we reviewed some 43 studies about defense and electromagnetic spectrum issues. There was remarkable agreement among those studies on the challenges to DoD's EM spectrum capabilities. These challenges included outdated capabilities themselves, lengthy and disjointed acquisition process, increased spectrum competition and congestion, and gaps in experienced staff and training, realistic training. Many of these studies also agreed with DoD officials that among the chief causes for lack of progress in many of these areas was governance. DoD issued department-wide electromagnetic spectrum strategies in 2013 and 2017, and published a third strategy in October 2020. We found that DoD had not fully implemented either the 2013 or 2017 strategies. This was not because they were bad strategies, quite the opposite, but rather because of bureaucratic and organizational hindrances. Specifically, DoD did not take action to develop detailed implementation plans, focus leadership on offices and individuals with authority to execute, or create processes to review progress and assess results to ensure that they achieve intended outcomes. Rather than do these things, DoD re-sought and remade each successive strategy. We think this pattern threatens potential success for the 2020 strategy. In our December report, we made recommendations in each of these areas. DoD generally agreed with our recommendations and told us the department planned to address many of them in the implementation plan for the 2020 strategy. In just under 2 weeks, DoD will reach its own 180-day deadline for issuing that implementation plan. We've not yet seen it, but we do look forward to seeing the extent to which DoD takes the kind of actions we identified in December 2020. In conclusion, DoD's response to our December report shows that officials are well aware of the challenges and opportunities affecting military use of the EM spectrum. Ultimately, by addressing the gaps and challenges noted in our report, DoD would improve its ability to innovate and expand in the way that Mr. Clark and Dr. Connolly have mentioned, and operate in that spectrum. This is important to achieve the department's vision of spectrum superiority. I look forward to continuing to work with you and the department to help address spectrum challenges and to make the most of its opportunities. Chairman Langevin, Ranking Member Stefanik, members of the subcommittee, this completes my prepared statement, and I'm happy to address any questions you may have.
Very good. Dr. Kirschbaum, thank you very much for your testimony, and to the panel. Greatly appreciate you being here today. I'm anxious to get to questions. I'm going to defer and go last in the questions. We get members into we're going to get flights. And with that, I'm going to yield time first to Mr. Larson for 5 minutes. I'm sorry. Yes, Mr. Larson for 5 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that very much. I've got to get out to Dulles Airport, so I appreciate that. Dr. Kirschbaum, in 2006, 15 years ago, the Electronic Warfare Working Group at the time it was named, issued a report on EW in the Pentagon that concluded that what needed to happen for focus was that it needed to be, we needed to have leadership. We needed to have a pipeline of training on EW, and we needed to have the research and development budgets that resulted in capabilities. Can you explain to me that how it, if I came back, if I was here 15 years from now, that your report, which largely mirrors a report that we wrote 15 years ago, won't say the same thing?
That's a great question. I'm hopeful that it won't for a number of reasons. The first of which is the amount of attention that's paid to this critical issue by you, Chairman Langevin, Ranking Member Stefanik, and people like us, whereas it was much more specialized in those days. Now, what we see when we interview the people in the Pentagon that are responsible for putting the strategies together, they get it. They understand the critical issues. They understand the impact and the way the operational doctrine needs to change, the way that needs to flow into training, the way that needs to drive innovation. What happens is, as I alluded to, once those strategies are put out and everyone signs off on them, they go into the normal process. And that normal process is governed by the servicers who are responsible for training and equipping forces.
Right.
They have their priorities. And even though you have broad agreement about that things like EM Spectrum cut across all those efforts, when push comes to shove and the dollars get spent, they're not gonna achieve.
Can I stop you there? Because this is a great segue for a question for Mr. Conley, who pointed out the PLA strategic the strategic support forces, the SSF, is actually organized so that cyber and space are on par with the other services, and points out that we don't have that when it comes to EMSO. So, Mr. Conley, can you address how we can get there and if we can get there, or do your recommendations even help us get there?
Right. So what I would offer is, in my opinion, the part that China with their strategic support force did in a way that I think is really insightful and can be valuable for us is, first off, the blending of electronic warfare, cyberspace, and space operations as peers. And secondarily, that elevation to say this is strategically important and we are going to use it to achieve a strategic outcome. It's the combination of both of those things that I think are really important for operationally what they have been able to do. There is a governance conversation, there is a structure conversation, there's a resourcing conversation, but what they've achieved operationally, I think, is really pretty darn impressive.
We should find out more about that. And I want to ask Mr. Clark in my remaining time. I have NAS Whidbey Island in my district. We have the Growlers. We've got the jamming pods on those. These are the expensive platforms that you were talking about that they certainly do have a critical function in certain areas, but not in other areas. And how would you how should we think about balancing the resources that we give to EMSO largely, whether it's a platform like a plane or a platform like a motherboard?
Right. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of great work that's been going on in terms of research and development over the last decade to develop small form factor electronic warfare, electromagnetic warfare systems that can go onto UAVs, and also the networking to allow networked electronic warfare. And so what I would see in the future is that the Growler now is going to be the quarterback, right? It will be the quarterback for electromagnetic warfare operations. So it may not be doing a mod escort jamming operation where it's going to get in relatively close and jam an air defense radar so that a bomber can go hit a target. It may stand back and be coordinating the actions by both itself and then some expendable UAVs that'll go in closer. And some of those are being developed by DOD right now. But what that means is some of that investment is going to have to shift away from the platform to these other systems.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for yielding me your time in the beginning so I can get to the airport. I very much appreciate that. And I don't yield back because I have no time to yield back. So I won't be pretentious and ask and say I'm going to yield back anything. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, very, very good. And I appreciate your leadership in this area. I know that you take great pride in the work that you've done and working to try to solve this problem. So thank you for your leadership and your expertise that you bring to the table too.
Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you very much. Now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Sure, I will yield to Mr. Moore, who looks like he's in an airport right now. Blake, you want to take my 5 minutes for questions?
I'm good for another 40 minutes. I'm not in any immediate rush, so I'm actually okay if you want to give your opening statements. Thank you, though. I appreciate that. But yes, I am at the airport, but I'm okay for the next 45 minutes.
Okay, so I'll take back that time. He'll yield it back to me.
Yield back.
My question is, Mr. Clark, in your report, The Invisible Battlefield, you and your colleagues provide extensive analysis of China's strategy, operational concepts, and their 4 stages to achieve electromagnetic spectrum superiority. Number 1, meticulous planning. Number 2, multi-level integration. Number 3, precise release of energy. And number 4, demonstrating effects. In which of those stages do you believe that China is most effective, and which of those stages is the U.S. most vulnerable? And then what are your overall thoughts on China's ability to effectively execute these steps to superiority?
Well, thank you for the question. So they're very well positioned to be able to execute these steps. I would say that the ones where they have the most efficacy is the meticulous planning. They've analyzed our battle networks to an exquisite degree of detail, both through clandestine means and because they just look and see what we've got available on the open web, to figure out how we're going to put our pieces together to be able to create a set of forces that are going to conduct an operation. And then they've also done very well at building the specific systems necessary to release the precise energy that's going to disconnect the parts of our battle network away from each other. So to jam our communications, to deceive our sensors. So they've identified what those key nodes are in the force packages that we're going to send downrange so they can prevent them from being effective. So they've done very well at those 2 steps, I would say, in particular, the planning and the release of energy. The demonstrating of effects, I see less from them. I mean, the goal there is to try to deter us by showing that they not only have planned this out, but they've figured out how to release the energy in specific ways that can defeat our battle networks. So they're working on that, and obviously we've seen indications of that in the intel world, but they have not done as much of that as I thought they might, given the gray zone operations they've been pursuing.
Thank you. I will yield back the balance of my time.
Very good. Next, Ms. Escobar, if you're still there, I'll recognize you for 5 minutes.
I am. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, not just for this hearing, but also for the accommodation that you're making on a Friday fly home day, especially for those of us who live further away. And to our panel, thank you so much for your work, your expertise, and your testimonies, which are really informative and helpful. My questions are for Dr. Conley, and actually I really appreciate Dr. Clark's focus on the need to be adaptable, and Dr. Connolly, your emphasis on innovation. One of the many goals of the 2020 Electromagnetic Spectrum Operations Strategy under the Defense Department has been to develop new EMS capabilities. In my home district of El Paso, Texas, the University of Texas at El Paso, or UTEP, has been a leading force in the worldwide revolution of 3D printing. In 2000, the Keck Center and UTEP's College of Engineering made strategic investments in additive manufacturing technologies in order to assist manufacturers in prototyping parts before investing in costly manufacturing tools needed for production. Most recently, in 2018, UTEP became the North American base of operations for one of the world's emerging technology leaders in the production of 3D printing equipment. As you strategically evaluate opportunities to strengthen our EMS capabilities, to what extent would you say there are components and applications of EMS that can be potentially involved with additive manufacturing?
Yep. So I really appreciate that question. It is, as an engineer myself, this is a fascinating and great time to be a practicing engineer in any way, shape, or form. And the reason for saying that is really based around what's happening with the digital transformation and the ability to do a digital design to rapidly prototype, additive manufacturing being exactly one of those capabilities, and the ability to actually not have to prototype and go and exhaustively test it to then redesign, to then build the actual thing that you want, but to actually take that 3D piece and go and immediately start using it. And so what I think is really exciting about additive manufacturing are all of the different places it allows us to more rapidly integrate a capability onto a platform and do really well there. There is one part, though, that I think is really core to our electronic warfare, our electromagnetic warfare, and our EMSO capabilities, which is the microelectronics, which underpin them. And for where we are today, additive manufacturing won't solve that part of the problem, but it will solve substantial parts of the problem that we have, and I think will allow us to go faster, more affordably, and generate more value.
And Dr. Connolly, just in the time that I have left, just a couple minutes, how do we best utilize that talent, that skill set, that brain power in academia, in these young minds, and connect them to the work that we need to do to innovate and to lead and to demonstrate superiority?
Yep. So one of the things that I mentioned in my opening statement was that ability to broadly and democratically share information and insights that we have. And so I think in many cases we have challenges and problems that we actually can expose to the academic community, to students prior to them joining the workforce, prior to worrying about things like security clearances, and we can actually get them working on problems that really matter. When you look underneath the hood of our MSO capabilities today, the vast majority of them are really defined by software-defined radio technology. And these are things that you actually can go ahead and, play with on a college campus and work with for the entirety of your time while you're in school, and immediately bring that knowledge into being a technology developer in support of our MSO capabilities and ultimately our national defense with strategic implications.
Thank you so much, Dr. Connolly. This is, I think, an exciting area of opportunity for us, one that we definitely need to exploit. Mr. Chairman, again, thank you so much for accommodating me before I run to the airport. I yield back.
You're very welcome. Glad you get your questions in, and have a safe flight home.
Thank you.
Let's see. I don't have the list in front of me. I think we're going to go with Mr. Moore next. I'm not sure. I don't have the seniority list. They have not sent me that list quite just yet. So I apologize to my colleagues if I'm going out of order. But Mr. Moore, I'll recognize you for 5 minutes. Nope. He may be offline.
Vice.
Okay. Ms. Bites is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. As a freshman, I'm still learning a lot about this particular issue, and so I appreciate you all kind of bringing some historical context to what you've done in the past. My question is really a twofold question. Mr. Clark and Dr. Conley, you really talked about making a shift in how we manage the spectrum, and then also research and development and investment in the future. Can you talk a little bit or flesh a little bit more out? How do we incentivize young people to want to look at this particular issue, because it's in some ways sort of abstract, right? You can't see it, feel it, touch it. How do you sort of explain and understand, or explain and incite someone that may be looking at this to get involved? And then what do you see on the research front? What do we need? What's the long-term vision for us trying to figure out what's next on the horizon past electromagnetic spectrum?
Well, I can start because I think Dr. Connolly is going to have a lot more to say on this subject than I do. But I will say, I think one of the most important things is to make an area, a technology area, exciting for people to want to go into. Today, electrical engineering in a lot of cases means computer engineering. And back when I was in college, it meant actually dealing with circuits and wires and stuff. So I think that part of it is shifting people's focus to think of this as an exciting area of research. And one of the ways to do that is this focus on adaptable cognitive systems that are AI enabled, basically taking advantage of the virtualization that is happening in machines to begin to use our electromagnetic spectrum systems more like virtualized computer type systems, where they're able to adapt in real time to an adversary's emissions, create new techniques and new waveforms in real time to be able to defeat those jamming effects or to create a new communications link with another platform. So that kind of merging of the software and the hardware worlds, if you will, I think could be very exciting for people to go into. And it deals with the problem that I just talked with Member Stefanik about, which is the advent of the Chinese approach to warfare, where they plan meticulously, develop a way to defeat our forces. But then if we present them something that's much less predictable because we're using these cognitive and AI-enabled electromagnetic systems, it might defeat that attempt on their part to take apart our battle networks. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. What I would add is in my own story, I studied nanotechnology when I did my PhD. And so nanotechnology intrinsically is, well, nano, something small, and therefore something invisible. And so personally, it was a very easy journey for me into this EMSO community because I was already used to studying and working on things that candidly I couldn't see without using specialized tools. The electromagnetic spectrum in many ways is no different. And building on, Mr. Clark's comments there on the AI side, that ability to expose someone to the most pressing national security challenges for them to understand the impact of what that meant. In my case, it was a radio-controlled improvised explosive device on a roadside in Iraq or Afghanistan, and the ability to say, if we figure out how to defeat this thing, we can save lives. That is motivation to get up and get to go to work in a way that nearly nothing else is. And so I think there's a lot there that we actually can get, young kids really excited about as soon as they finish college. And so I think there's a great opportunity there. The second thing that I will offer, and one of the really unique things about EMSO, is that the rate of technology adoption and the critical nature of it is profound for the implications it has. Brian and I previously have chatted about this exact topic. The rate of the innovation of new radar and radar warning receivers during World War II for the identification of German U-boats in the Bay of Biscay, it was a standard period of time of 4 months. And that was 7 decades ago now. And it was 4 months from measure to countermeasure. Today, we should expect it to be even faster. You can't do that with a large aircraft, but you can with a software-defined radio capability and implementing EMSO holistically.
And what about the research and development piece? What do you see as far as needs for DOD to invest in this? I think the need is there, but how do you sort of push that to the forefront? And what are we looking at?
Yep. What I would offer is it's a mix of what's happening with microelectronics with the ability to use them in a defense application. It's very different when you put a chip in an air-conditioned, climate-controlled environment versus on a military aircraft that shakes when it flies. And so we have to get that part right. There's a lot about the thermal there that is really critical. And then the other side is it's really easy to get excited about the digital, but in reality, there's a lot of really hard analog problems on the radio frequency side, filters, mixers, components that have to go in to really be able to get that performance at a level that we want. And every time you start talking about advanced technologies, price almost immediately shows up. And so how do we generate that at a value that we can do in low quantity for defense applications while we get that necessary value out of it? And so if I was to offer a couple suggestions for really important problems to work on, I think those would be my top couple.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Bice. I think that I'm next, unless there's another member of the Democratic side who's on that hasn't been recognized. But let me start with this, and I know we've touched on this a bit already, but let me just jump into it again and we can expand on it. For Mr. Clark or Dr. Conley, I wanted to know, again, further discuss, is DOD adequately leveraging spectrum to enable future concepts like multi-domain operations, distributed maritime operations, and joint all-domain command and control? And how will those concepts contribute to future U.S. military operations? In addition, how do we ensure that both legacy and future capabilities and systems are networked and interoperable among military services? We can start with Mr. Clark and then go to Dr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on joint all-domain command and control, one of the things we're finding in the work that we're doing there is that in the future, our communication networks are going to not be able to necessarily provide us the command and control relationships we always want. We want to have this very hierarchical command and control scheme with somebody in a distant headquarters controlling forces way out in the field. Our networks aren't going to be able to do that against a capable adversary like China. So instead, we're going to have to think about adjusting our command and control relationships to accommodate our communications availability, which means we're going to have to be ready to shift the command node to different places at different times, depending on what communications are available. So that's going to reinforce this idea of we need interoperable forces that are able to quickly mix and match their forces to be able to create force packages that can deliver the right effects at the time. So interoperability will be really important, and also the network flexibility will be very important. So to get that network flexibility, we need systems that are agile and can move across the spectrum to avoid enemy jamming, and then can be able to communicate with one another where they are so they can reconnect their networks in a mesh sort of framework. So that requires systems that are able to work across a wide range of frequencies and adjust their bandwidth and power levels to minimize their chances of being detected. So agility both in power and in beam width and beam direction and in frequency are going to be necessary. And then we're going to need to be able to cause those forces to interoperate. So instead of trying to use gateways to connect a force that uses a link 16 to a guy who's using a MATL to a guy who's using SATL, 3 different communication protocols. We're going to have to use software-defined toolkits like Stitches, which is a program that DARPA developed, which builds a interoperable connection between those 2 networks on the fly. So instead of having to build a hardware gateway between the 2, it'll write software in real time to accommodate that connection. So
Can I ask you,
those are some of the things we do.
is that something that is exquisite technology that will be DOD folks, or are there commercial off-the-shelf options that we can adopt and get in the field more quickly?
So the Stitches and similar programs are DOD systems today. There are some commercial versions of those. So we talked about software-defined radios. There's a new version. The new radio that is part of the 5G infrastructure is a software-defined radio that can reprogram its waveforms in real time if programmed correctly to do that. So there are commercial systems that allow you to reprogram a radio to use a different waveform in real time that could allow a radio to talk to another radio that maybe it wasn't originally designed to work with. So there are commercial versions of this because, of course, interoperability is a thing in the commercial world as well.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Conley?
Yeah, the one thing that I would add on top of what Mr. Clark said is with electromagnetic battle management, the integration of that with the multi-domain operation, joint all-domain command and control, the ability to maneuver in and through the electromagnetic spectrum is something that every time that you turn the dial on your radio, you actually are doing. You are maneuvering in the electromagnetic spectrum when you do that in the same way that you can move to a different lane on the highway. Your cell phone does that automatically today with all of the different adjustments that are happening underneath the hood. But for a military commander, the ability to go ahead and not only physically maneuver an aircraft, a ship, a ground unit, but also maneuver in the electromagnetic spectrum in a coordinated scheme, it's actually what I alluded to in my opening statement. It may be one of the best strategic offensive advantages that we can actually have that will be enduring in a way that I think is really powerful for us. And so that's an area that I personally am really excited about.
Very good. Thank you. And Dr. Connolly, again, elaborating on this, I think you touched on this earlier, but the perspective you can provide on the speed at which DOD adapts and moves to address challenges versus what you've seen in the private sector thus far. How do you think DOD can better incorporate private sector innovation and talent at scale and speed up its ability to innovate to confront emerging threats and take advantage of opportunities?
Yep. So there's 2 dramatically different directions I could take the answer. And so one of which that has been suggested many times is how do we shorten the planning cycle and how do we allow a new program to start at a faster rate? I'm not going to touch on that because I think that that's been discussed substantially by others, but it definitely is one viable option. The other option is how can you attract commercial capital into our nation's defense problems? And how can you go ahead and generate a rate of return that will attract that capital to come into the ecosystem? And I think that we actually can plan that in a way that is much more familiar to those of us that are used to the federal budgeting process, but we can actually go ahead and set up an ecosystem that allows that to occur. And so that's what I touched on earlier with that, making sure for both traditional defense contractors as well as non-traditional commercial companies that want to service the defense ecosystem, how do we give the appropriate expectation for the income statement, for the balance sheet, for the cash flow side to actually make our national security problems an area that they want to work in with a business model that closes?
Good. I'll hold there, and hopefully we'll have time for a second round. But I'll hold there for now. Thank you for those answers. Mr. Moore is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to continue a little bit with what we were discussing a few questions ago. I was intrigued by the concept of how we encourage students and new professionals to get into this. workforce development's been something that I continually harp on and am very frustrated that in my role in Congress, I don't know how to fix it. But it's something that I definitely want to be involved with. Could you speak to anything that can be specifically done and to encourage, whether it be on the commercial side, whether it be potential, jobs within the federal government and within the DOD, what changes would we need to make to our educational institutions to get them so they would be equipped in addressing some of this need and being able to prepare and produce enough talent that we can answer the call for the future on this particular issue. I speak with the sense my district is Hill Air Force Base in the 1st District of Utah, and they talk to me all the time about they could hire as many electrical engineers or any type of engineers as would graduate in Utah and still have a need. What specifics would you foresee? And this question, I'll throw it to all of you. Thank you for being here. What shift does education need to do to produce this? And is there anything we can do, even as a committee, to encourage or incentivize potential employers for providing the necessary credentialing or certifications that would be needed? I'll pause there.
So the first part that I would offer and there's a lot of facets of this. Unfortunately, it's a complex problem, as you pointed out. The first part that I would go ahead and emphasize is making sure that we are attracting graduate students and undergraduate students to our universities who ultimately stand a decent chance of going on to work in defense. When we look at kind of where is the biggest segmentation of the pipeline of the total available talent versus those that are interested, I think that's an area that we definitely should consider what would be required to help there. And so I offer that as a data point to you. The secondary part of it that I would offer is making sure that we're bringing in people with the right skills, the right education, the right background for what type of problem it is that we need. As someone with a Doctor of Philosophy degree, not every problem in the electronic warfare community that I have been able to work on over the years requires a PhD, right? And so with that in mind is how do we make sure that people are broadly aware of these problems, but we get the right problem to the right person's desk for them to work on. And so I think there's a lot that we can do there as we say, what is the role of industry? What is the role of government? And what type of skill sets do we want in which different places to make sure that we do the right thing? The third part that I would offer, I had a peer in the Pentagon. He and his wife had 3 children, all of whom went on to work in basically the high-tech side of industry on advanced AI, advanced robotics. Despite the fact that he's a Naval Academy grad, none of his 3 kids are working on defense programs. He and his wife met in the Navy. And so that is a little bit of a unique opportunity, I think, to say, what is there that culturally we want to do to make sure that we make these types of problems accessible? But what do we also want to do on the business side to attract that kind of talent? A young graduate that's excited and passionate is looking for a company where they get equity today. If you look at federal acquisition regulations and you say, hey, I would like to go ahead and give a 22-year-old engineer a share of this company, that is not a cost that you actually can go ahead and pass on. And so I think the question is, how do we get the right business model to drive things to create a culture both in the private and the public sector that really attracts what we want to achieve?
Let me, please go ahead.
I would add, one of the things we've looked at in the work we've been doing inside the Pentagon has been professionalizing the electromagnetic spectrum operations community, which is not just the military side. So trying to get the professional development for the military side such that folks in that world feel like they are developing as technicians or as supervisors and leaders, but also on the civilian side. And we've done not a great job in the DOD of professionalizing the folks that work in the electromagnetic spectrum operations community on the engineering and the program management side. They feel like they're just kind of a cog in the overall organization. They could be easily interchanged out with somebody else, when in fact that's not really true. So by professionalizing the track, people come in to work at the labs, people come to work at the warfare centers, and they feel like they're entering a professional community that's going to have their back and is going to develop them over time. That's something that DOD has been trying to do and has failed to really pull together. But on the civilian side, if we could do that, it would make the DOD a much more attractive employer to young engineers coming out and looking potentially for a long-term, or at least a career for a while.
Let me quickly add in here. This technology is going to change rapidly, in my opinion, and is almost exponentially. Are we equipped at the DoD level to be able to reskill and upskill our current workforce so they can continually meet the challenge, or does this have to then, once they've been in the industry 5 years, do they have to go back? Do we have to go dig deep into the education world and bring out the new pieces? Are we going to be able to adjust on the fly? Is my question.
I think we could rapidly reskill people, and I'll let Bill answer.
Yeah, now you'll.
I would offer, I think that we can definitely upskill. And there is a lot of the analog side of the problem in particular, which is a little bit like art, and it's art meets a lot of science, but you need that artisan that understands the history of why we do things today. And so I think there is a lot that we can do with upskilling the current workforce.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Chairman. I apologize. I yield back.
No worries. Thank you, Mr. Moore. Elise, I only had one or two more questions. Are you okay if we go for a second round?
Mhm. Yes.
Okay, great. Dr. Kirschbaum, I know we kind of talked on this as well, but DOD is now in its third electromagnetic spectrum strategy in 7 years. Based on what the GAO has seen, is this strategy different from the prior two, and should we expect a different result? What steps can Congress take to ensure positive momentum and implementation? I know we kind of talked on this, talked about, I think, Mr. Larson's line of questions, but if you want to elaborate.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you hit on it rather well. And first of all, we, as I said in my opening statement, we're concerned about the direction for the implementation of 2020 because so far we've seen a pattern before. So we are concerned about it, but the strategies themselves have definitely recognized a lot of the concepts that my colleagues and I have hit on. The idea that you need to innovate and not just catch up with technology. You need to think of bigger concepts. These strategies themselves have taken aboard some of those ideas. The idea of how we appreciate and understand electromagnetic spectrum and operations today is different than it was just a few years ago, and these strategies incorporate those ideas. There are also a lot of consideration right now for ideas that are going to make some of the connections, hopefully, in the operational side, how you tie these things together into battle management, how you achieve some of those broader effects. Those kind of things are going to be critical to glom onto for future, whether it's the education in motivating people for education we just talked about, or whether it's system development. Those are all critical to do that. In order to get there, we've got to put the right department emphasis on achieving those things and making sure that what we're doing, what we're testing, what we're breaking apart, what we're learning lessons from, what we're then going back into experiment with, that's the rhythm, and that's the accepted rhythm, and that's what we're doing. That's what really needs to be done, and that's what we're looking forward to.
Very good. If I could, too, given the organizational challenges that you've highlighted today and how these issues impact so many issues across the information environment, including electromagnetic spectrum issues, cybersecurity, cyberspace operations, and information operations, what organizational changes would you recommend the subcommittee and/or DoD consider to address these broader issues?
So I would say that if you look at the balance of our recommendations that we made in 2020 on this, we're very specific that it needs to be organizational responsibility to execute the strategy. So that needs to be offices and/or people who have the authority and responsibility to do so. It is the next best thing to say we don't care who that is, except for those conditions need to be achieved. It needs to be someone who has the authority to execute, backed up by a process to assess what actions are taking and assess whether or not those actions met the intent of the vision. Those things are going to help the department get over the hump, as it were, that we've seen in other areas. So, for example, you're well aware, sir, that we've worked with you and Ranking Member Stefanik on things like the DoD cyber strategy implementation. And we've seen a difference in those cases where you have someone with authority and a process to back it up, you've seen some progress. And this, your committee in particular, has been vital in ensuring that success. We've seen it in other areas, like with the nuclear enterprise, nuclear deterrence reform efforts, where it's got the attention, and that helps push things along in terms of where we need to go on innovation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kirschbaum. Ranking Member Stefanik, you recognize.
I have no further comments or questions, Jim, so I'll yield
Okay.
back for the next
Okay.
Republican.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Bice.
Don't have any additional questions either, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Then Mr. Moore.
No additional. If you could summarize, in fact, let me just be very, very brief. If you could summarize, like, as we just kind of wrap this up, what would you say compared to some of our key adversaries? Where's our biggest deficient area that we need to focus on? So, and then if we want to say Russia and China, that's great. Or if you feel like there's other adversaries that could be targeting, what areas are we most vulnerable? I'd love to just get your candid thoughts. It's not scripted or anything like that. And I'll pause there.
So I'd say our biggest vulnerability is our reliance on active sensors and wide area, high power networks. When we have to operate inside the near abroad of China or Russia, we're on their turf. They're the home team. They've got their sensor networks out there. They're able to listen for any of our emissions. So the fact that our ships and our airplanes have to rely to a great degree on active radars to be able to do missile defense or active radars to find targets, and then on these wide area networks like Link 16 to communicate, makes us, very, very detectable. It makes it easy for them to figure out what we're doing and attack us. That is our biggest vulnerability, I think, is this home team advantage that the Chinese and Russians have, and the fact that we need to develop new technologies and tactics to be able to still operate in those contested areas using passive sensors and multi-static sensors and LPI, low probability intercept, low probability detection sensors. So it's a different approach that we need to mount, which is uncomfortable in a lot of ways for the military forces of today.
From my perspective, I would offer we have to ensure that we train as we intend to fight. In many cases, I think we actually have an adequate understanding of adversary capabilities. But when you look at the operational level and we bring operational units together to train before a deployment, we want to make sure that we exercise our command and control network in a way that demonstrates that we have command and control over those forces and we're able to execute everything we want. That is exactly what either China or Russia would attempt to fight us in. And it's an area when we prepare, we have to make sure we get right. At the operational level, I would offer that. At the strategic level, the other thing I would offer is, I believe from the 3 different testimonies that this subcommittee has received so far this year for this session of Congress, this is the first one that does not have a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, either acting or confirmed in the role, who is appearing. And so making sure that at the strategic level, the investment that we are making is aligned with where we want the strategy to go, and making sure there is that senior leader buy-in from the budgeting side.
I would say it's kind of a melding of those two areas. 2 things. The first is, from that strategic level, the appreciation of where and how vital the EM spectrum operations are to that entire information environment. As I mentioned, its importance to everything from strategic messaging, information operations, cyber. That incorporation and appreciation from the strategic, operational, and tactical level is crucial, and we're not quite there. The other one is much more of the kind of the pace, that technology, doctrine, learning pace. One of the dangers of inviting a historian to testify is you're going to get some examples from a long time ago. So in 1914, armies marched off to war with the appreciation that the machine gun was an awesome weapon. They had the machine guns set up in separate units that you kind of used them where you needed them. Well, it didn't take long to figure out that that was the wrong way to use them. And the army that figured out first that machine guns need to be deployed in numbers throughout specific units to support actual operations, they had an advantage right away. And that was the German army did that. Right now, we're kind of marching off in 1914. We think of these kind of spectrum operations as enablers for existing operation, and a lot of ways we still treat them that way. They're not as integrated as they need to be throughout the force. That a lot of the work we saw characterized that. So that's the thing the hump we need to get over.
Thank you. I'll yield back. I appreciate the perspective there. Thank you, Chairman.
Very, very good. Thank you, Mr. Moore. I guess I had one last one. I guess maybe this might be for Dr. Kirschbaum, but also Dr. Connolly might want to weigh in about what I guess who or what entity within DOD is responsible for ensuring new and existing systems can connect to one another. Who is responsible for that plan and process, especially systems owned by different services?
So I would love Dr. Connolly to help with this, because I know he's going to have some very, very good opinions on it. Right now, the answer is everyone. Obviously, the CIO is responsible for that communication side and interoperability, but for system development, the responsibility also lies in other places, and that's actually one of the issues we've seen over time with this and other areas, where the responsibility to ensure that these systems are developed in an integrated fashion falls second, third, and fourth order of priority versus individual service area development. So you don't get the connectivity.
Yeah, it's a bit troubling, obviously, I'd say the least. So, Dr. Connolly?
Yeah, so completely agree with CIO owning the strategy and the policy around that. The other thing that I would add is obviously the services at the program officer level, the PEO level, obviously have a lot of responsibility, obviously on the acquisition piece. I think the only part that we didn't touch on yet is the JROC and the requirements process, and ensuring whenever we can, we articulate which links we want to make sure have to be able to talk with each other. Or how we set that expectation into a requirement that ultimately is testable, so we can make sure that we are meeting that strategic objective that you mentioned.
Very good. Thank you. I have no further questions. I'll just ask the ranking member if you have anything. Okay. Very good. Well, this has been an excellent hearing. I want to thank you all for your time today. Your incredibly valuable insights. You're giving us a lot to think about and to work on. Look forward to staying in touch. Members may have additional questions that they may want to submit for the record. If you could help in responding to those, that we'd appreciate that. So with that, again, excellent hearing. Thank you all for being here today and what you've had to say. It's been incredibly helpful. With that, this hearing stands adjourned.